Namaste. My name is Amog and welcome to my podcast. Today, in this episode 2, I want to talk about something very close to me and a bit at length. If you follow me on Twitter, you might know that I never shut up about it, and the issue is free speech. It is the freedom of individuals to speak without fear of repercussions from the government. More broadly, this is termed as freedom of speech and expression, since some other forms of expressions like writing or placards or even gestures are not speech but just general expressions to display one's opinions. This is quite a contentious issue in the modern parlance, but not just in the modern parlance. It has always been a subject of particular interest in history. One might ask, why is this right, the right to be able to speak freely, so important in the first place? Why do we need it? And indeed, I propose that we need it. Why do we need that right? Why should one be allowed to speak? It's a strange question, you see. Why should one be allowed to speak? I mean, who allows you to do anything? An authority, right? Why would you follow orders of anyone in your personal life? Let's just put it this way. Who would you say owns you in this particular regard? It used to be God or the king of the land, at least in the common law traditions. Indian legal system derives heavily from the common law system. Therefore, it has to be understood in order to understand where these ideas actually come from. Common law basically means the body of customary law based upon judicial decisions and embodied in reports of decided cases. The modern Indian state actually inherits the common law tradition from England. Now, the history of England, where common law originates from, is quite interesting. Well, I'll not get into all of it, obviously, but only the parts that are relevant for this discussion. I'll start at a particularly interesting point. In the 12th and 13th centuries, England was ruled by the Angevin kings of French origin, and their rule was quite arbitrary and hence tyrannical. I mean, they could just do anything that they wanted. It was based on the premise of vis et voluntas, or force and will, which was justified. The rule of the kings in this manner was justified using the idea that the king was above the law. King John had already lost a lot of his ancestral land in France in the 13th century, early 13th century. And he had suffered a tragic loss in the Battle of Bouvines in France. This had led to an economic downfall back in his kingdom, which he tried to recover from by levying taxes on the barons. This loss in the battle meant that his position had actually weakened among the barons. As he returned from France in the year 1214 or 1215, he found that some of the barons had actually rebelled against him. The barons proposed that King John sign the Charter of Liberties that King Henry had signed in the previous century, guaranteeing some key liberties to the barons. The barons by now had actually taken London, so they were at a better point of negotiating with King John. During these negotiations, they actually added a few new articles to the earlier Charter of Liberties and demanded that the king accept them. This new charter eventually became the Magna Carta Libertatum, or the Great Charter of Liberties. Of the many clauses in the Magna Carta, some are relevant even today, and they still find their essence in the British legal system, and therefore in a lot of other legal systems as well. One of them guarantees liberties and rights to the Church of England. Another one guarantees some other liberties and rights to the towns of London and some other towns in England. And the third and the most important of them gives all English subjects the right to justice and a fair trial. I'm quoting from that, a translation of that Magna Carta now. No free man shall be seized or imprisoned or stripped of his rights or possessions or outlawed or exiled or deprived of his standing in any other way. Nor will we proceed with force against him or send others to do so, except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. To no one will we sell, to no one deny or delay right or justice. End quote. This is a very powerful statement. And this was signed, by the way, in the year 1215. So it's 805 years ago. However, this first charter actually failed to produce any long-lasting effects. King John, after the signing of this letter, he was unhappy with it. So he sent a letter to the Pope. In spite of their differences, I mean, he had differences with the Pope. So the king had a difference with the church. But still, the Pope then proclaimed that the Magna Carta was illegal, unjust, harmful to royal rights, and shameful to all English people. And then he declared the charter to be null and void of all validity forever. This incident single-handedly demonstrates that both the government and religion interfered with people's liberties. This actually started a movement among ordinary people, demanding more and more liberties from the law and the church. After this, another charter was signed in the year 1225. Another one was signed in the year 1297. This fight for liberties continued for many centuries, and it is very much going on even today. The traces of morality of liberties is seen most notably and most significantly in the Bill of Rights of England, signed in the year 1689, and in the American Bill of Rights, which was ratified in the year 1791. Continuing the trend of Britain, which was pretty much a leading light of the Western world for quite some time in that time, let's jump a few centuries. Okay. These centuries obviously were filled with tyrannical rulers and church transgressions into whatever we would call now as individual liberties. One has to understand that everything we take for granted today, even the right not to be arbitrarily put in jail or habeas corpus, or even the right to merely get mathematical treatises printed, all of these things were very hard fought. We have to understand that. We take these things for granted today, but they were not easily given to us. For example, the invention of the printing press by Johann Gutenberg. It is seen as an engineering marvel and a revolution, which it is. But it is not just that, but so much more. Because copying books was the only way of distributing any book far and wide, right? And right up to the invention of the printing press, it was a tedious job to copy books by hand. They had to be rewritten every single time. Printing allowed a large-scale copying and increase in the production of books. And thus, printing press facilitated the distribution of books and pamphlets extremely easily. This Gutenberg Revolution, combined with Martin Luther, a professor in Germany in the 15th century, who is also the father of modern Protestantism, was labeled as heretical by the Roman Catholic Church. The Gutenberg Revolution, that is the printing press, and Martin Luther were both called heretics. So, in response to that, which happened in 15th century, in the 16th century, the church decided that they wanted to ban the printing of certain books. And they published a list of such books, which was titled Index Expurgatorius, or the list of prohibited books. This list was edited more than 300 times over the next several decades. More and more books kept being added to it. It contained books by people such as René Descartes and Galileo Galilei. These people are very well known to those folk who paid attention in their science and math classes, by the way. René Descartes is the same person after whom the Cartesian coordinate system is named. And Galileo, obviously we know, who did a lot of other things, among inventing the telescope and doing a lot of things in the field of mechanics and astrophysics and all of that. So these were important people who were doing important things, and their books were censored by the church. Among the list of authors whose books were banned was another author, very interesting man named John Locke. This person is a very important figure in history, particularly in the history of tradition of liberty. He is often regarded as the father of liberalism. We'll come back to him later in some time. In this backdrop of all of this censorship by the church, the Parliament of England decided to end this censorship of published books by disbanding the Star Chamber in 1641. The Star Chamber was basically the body that decided which books were to be banned. So in 1641, the Star Chamber was disbanded and censorship ended. This immediately led to a rise in the number of publication of books, and in a span of 20 years, 300 works, approximately 300 different works were published. But hardly did people know that this was to be marred by another law, a new law that indicated that the Parliament was not really ready to let people speak their mind. In the year 1643, just 2 years after abolishing the Star Chamber, they came up with another new form of suppressing speech, which was actually more pernicious than censorship. This time, it was called the Licensing Order of 1643, which allowed the Parliament to censor books before they were published. This was an even bigger tyranny than censorship, because censorship could be done after the publication. A book could be replicated before it was censored. This didn't even allow that. Now, in this scenario, a poet, John Milton, rose to the occasion. He actually gave a speech in the British Parliament in the year 1644, approximately 16 months after the licensing order was passed, and it's called one of the greatest speeches in history in the defense of liberty and free expression. The speech is called Areopagitica. In that speech, Milton argued, and I'm quoting him now, "This is true liberty when freeborn men having to advise the public may speak free. What can be juster in a state than this?" End quote. He further states that the utmost bound of civil liberty is attained only when complaints are freely heard, deeply considered, and speedily reformed. He mentions that there was no practice of censorship till the year of 800 AD approximately. After that, the Spanish started censoring a few books. In Milton's own words, quote, "Books were ever as freely admitted into the world as any other birth. The issue of the brain was no more stifled than the issue of the womb. And that pre-publication licensing was born from the most anti-Christian council and the most tyrannous inquisition that ever inquired." End quote. Now this actually mentions a lot of Christian theology because the situation in England was such that everybody was Christian. They only had differences with people who followed different ideologies within Christianity. So this will have a religious rhetoric, but we need not concern ourselves with that. We just have to consider the issue at hand. Milton further wrote, and I quote, "God uses not to captivate under a perpetual childhood of prescription, but trusts man with the gift of reason to be his own chooser." End quote. This was the justification given that man is capable of separating wheat from the chaff, discerning truth from falsehoods, and distinguishing good from evil. He said that that evil was inextricably linked to good. Without evil to reject, man is merely a mechanical being, a being only in motion, not in mind. This, to me, was one of the most powerful lines in the entire speech. Now I'm going to say it. Quote, "A man may be a heretic in the truth, and if he believe things only because his pastor says so, or the assembly determines so, without knowing other reason, though his beliefs may be true, yet the very truth he holds becomes his heresy. End quote. What Milton is basically saying here is that if someone tells you something is the truth, now it may be a pastor, that means a religious leader, or an assembly, a group of people, if anyone tells you that something is the truth and you believe it, that itself is heresy, according to Milton. So he actually is trying to reinforce this point that a man has to be his own chooser. But alas, as effective in communicating the message as this speech may be today, it didn't help Milton's case in 1644. The licensing order, it was still there. It was only after the glorious revolution of 1688, when there was an overthrow of the current King James II and King William III was allowed to ascend the throne, only if he agreed to sign a Bill of Rights in the year 1689. In the year 1689, there was a change of power, like I just said, and it was only allowed to be done, that means William III was only allowed to be king if he agreed to sign a Bill of Rights. In 1689, he actually did sign a Bill of Rights, and this bill again guaranteed a few more liberties to the people of England, among which was the freedom of speech and expression in the Parliament, freedom to bear arms in self-defense, freedom to a fair trial, and freedom from being taxed by the royals without the agreement of a parliament. A few years later, in 1694, the licensing order was also allowed to expire. During this glorious revolution of 1688, there was another hero of free speech who came into the picture. His name was John Locke. In his work, A Letter Concerning Toleration, he had argued why opinions and religious beliefs contrary to that of the state should be tolerated. Thomas Hobbs, a contemporary of Locke, had argued in his book Leviathan that people may profess any religious beliefs privately as long as they outwardly expressed the religious beliefs of the state. Now, Locke was against such a notion. In his view, contrary to that of Hobbes, civil unrests arose from the state suppressing religion rather than squabbles among religions themselves. Which means there was a greater danger to public order from the state suppressing religions than the state allowing religions. Locke argued that the only way church could gain genuine converts was through persuasion, not through violence. Again, there's a Christian rhetoric here because of the contemporary situation in England, which was overwhelmingly Christian. So we can just ignore that part and concentrate on the part where he argues why toleration is very important. He argues that the church could only gain genuine converts, not fake converts that we see in India around, but genuine converts. The only way that church could gain them was through persuasion, was through conviction, not through violence, not through coercion. This is also why Locke insisted that government should not involve itself in the care of souls, something that we would now call as something like a proto-secularism in a way. Locke actually puts his idea of violence not being the answer brilliantly as I state further, so I'll quote him. Quote, "Force cannot create the change necessary for salvation, because while it can coerce obedience, it cannot change one's beliefs." This is a very important point. He says that people may say that they believe because you are threatening violence, but it will not really make them believe. You cannot really make people change their opinions by coercion. Locke also warned against people who supported the toleration of contrary religious beliefs that were only in the support of such tolerations until they were in a position where they could grab political power and do away with such a liberty. I'll explain this again. Locke had warned against certain people who were for toleration of different religious beliefs only because they were in a minority. He warned against that, because then what could happen was they would lay in wait these minority people, and they would support different religions or toleration of different religions as long as they were the minority. And as soon as they were the majority, they could grab political power and finish that liberty once and for all. Locke had warned against these people. Does this remind you of somebody in India today? Is there a religious segment which reminds you of this situation? I trust you to find the answer to that question. Such was the influence of Locke that it was clear in the American Bill of Rights, which was ratified in the year 1791, that they were also influenced by Locke. The founding fathers of America were influenced by Locke. Another hero of liberty and freedom of speech, and this person is, by the way, my most favorite one, is John Stuart Mill. He authored by far the most influential defense of liberty in his essay titled On Liberty. This essay has a special place because it expressly offers not only a defense of liberty from the state, but also states that the best reasons why each person must also embody that principle. He also argues that liberty is not just from the government, but also from the society itself. He introduced the harm principle that marked the extent to which a government can interfere in private matters. I'll read out a few quotes verbatim from On Liberty, because this is a very important document in my opinion. Mill defines liberty as follows. I'll quote: "Liberty will be defined as the nature and limit of the power which can be legitimately exercised by the society over the individual." End quote. That's how he defines liberty in a way. Now, why is this important? Is because we need to be a little clear with definitions, because when we say something, we need to make sure that the person who is listening to us understands exactly what we mean. Therefore, that was important. Now, I'll just state this principle, the harm principle, which is by far the most important principle when it comes to liberty. The harm principle goes like this, quote: "The only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against their will is to prevent harm to others." So any member of the civilized society can be allowed to do anything as long as they are not harming others. That's his philosophy. That's the harm principle. So no matter what I say or do, anyone else does not have the right to stop me from doing so as long as I'm not harming others. I may harm myself, but I may not harm them. That is the principle. Now, there are a lot of other things that Mill said which were very interesting. I'll quote this particular one. This is a very fantastic piece of literature right here. Quote: "If all mankind minus one were of one opinion, and only one person were of the contrary opinion, mankind would be no more justified in silencing that one person than he, if he had the power, would be justified in silencing mankind." End quote. He's basically defending the right of even one person to hold and propagate a contrary opinion to the rest of the entire humanity. On silencing an opinion, if the opinion is right, then the people are deprived of the opportunity of exchanging error for the truth. Which basically means if someone is telling you something and he's right, but you don't let him speak, then you never know what the truth is. But if that opinion is wrong, then they lose what is almost as great a benefit, the clearer perception and livelier impression of the truth. produced by its collision with the error. So which means if they are wrong and you don't let them speak, they will carry the wrong notion. So it's very important to let people speak, no matter how wrong they are, no matter how uninformed they are, no matter how offensive they are. To refuse hearing a person, to refuse hearing to an opinion because they are sure that it is false, it is to assume that their certainty in the same is absolute certainty. Which means if you don't even hear what the other person has to say, then that means you are assuming infallibility. You think you are infallible, which you are not, most probably. So, in the interest of getting to know the truth, you must at least try to hear what the other person is saying. Now, this is a very funny one. I'll quote from Mill directly. Quote, absolute princes or others who are accustomed to unlimited deference usually feel this complete confidence in their own opinions on nearly all subjects. End quote. Which means he's basically ridiculing people who are cocksure about everything. We see a lot of these people on Twitter, by the way, who are very sure of what they think about everything. They assume that they're infallible. John Stuart Mill calls them absolute princes. Mill also says that judgment is given to men and women so that they may use it. Just because it may be used erroneously, are they to be deprived of that judgment? Or should they not be used their judgment at all? People make mistakes, and those mistakes should be tolerated, as long as they are not extreme mistakes as to harm someone else. But just because a person may have a wrong opinion or may use their judgment incorrectly does not mean that we deprive them of that right or ask them not to use their own judgment. That's one of the arguments Mill gives. One more very interesting thing that Mill says is, he who knows only his side of the case knows little of that. So essential is the discipline of knowing both sides of an argument to a real understanding of moral and human subjects that if opponents of all important truths do not exist, it is indispensable to imagine them and supply them with the strongest arguments with which the most skillful devil's advocate can conjure up. This is, by the way, the definition of devil's advocate. Mill is basically saying that if a certain point of view, which is contrary to the popular notion of truth, does not have people defending that point of view, then it is incumbent upon us, it is incumbent upon the other set of people to play the devil's advocate and attack the popular idea in every which way possible. Not only the grounds of the opinion are forgotten in the absence of discussion, but too often the meaning itself is lost. What he's basically saying is that if there is no discussion of any issue, then not only do we miss out how we arrived at the right opinion or the right answer, but we also lose the meaning of the answer itself. The fatal tendency of mankind to leave off thinking about a thing when it is no longer doubtful is the cause of half of their errors. On heretical opinions, Mill again gives some very interesting opinions. He says, heretical opinions are generally some suppressed and neglected truths, bursting the bonds which keep them down, and either seeking reconciliation with the truth contained in the popular opinion, or fronting it as enemies and setting themselves up with similar exclusiveness as the whole truth. The latter case is hitherto the most frequent, as in the human mind, one-sidedness has always been the rule, and many-sidedness the exception. Hence, even in revolutions of opinion, one part of the truth usually sets while the other rises. In this particular passage, Mill is basically arguing that heretical opinions are based, most of the time, they are based in some form of the truth. In many cases, either the heretical opinion is seeking the approval of the truth or the popular opinion, or it is in opposition to the popular opinion. And he says that both are with respect to each other, they are always complementary with respect to each other. That's what the basic thesis of this particular passage is. Mill presents so many different kinds of defense of free speech that I cannot actually read out all of these things, all of these passages, all of these quotes that I've marked in his book. It's actually not a very large book. It's just a book 133, 134 pages long. But it is filled with quotable quotes. And it's only so because all of those arguments are very potent. I could actually go on and on quoting for Mill, but if anyone's interested, they should just read the book, if nothing else, if no other thing. But it's possible that the language might be a little tough. So there is a shorter and more concise version on this website called Heterodox Academy. I'll put the link in the description along with a reading list, which you could probably go and follow. It contains all the books that I have read so far. All the people that I have quoted, I've read their works, and I'll only put all of these things into the description, all of these things only which I have read. And I'll put a link of this website as well in the description. The website is called Heterodox Academy, and you might go in the library and search for all-1. It's a 25-page PDF, but it contains illustrations as well. This website was created by there's an academy, there's an entire academy called Heterodox Academy. It was created by this social psychologist Jonathan Haidt. Maybe you could go and see his other works as well. I actually personally also lack an in-depth reading of Indian philosophy on this very topic, on freedom of speech and liberty and all of these things. But I do intend to pursue reading of Indian philosophy in the future. Till then, I do know of only one defense of free speech and expression that occurs in any of the ancient Indian texts. And it's actually an incident from the book Natya Shastra. And the story of this was actually told by Salman Rushdie a few years ago. It's actually available on YouTube as well. But I'll just give you a very brief overview of what actually happened. What the story is. So, I think, in the Natya Shastra, Salman Rushdie actually explains this story as like this, that gods were a little bored in the heaven and they decided that they wanted some entertainment. And so there's a play made about the war between Indra and the Asuras. The play basically told how Indra used his mighty weapons to defeat the Asuras. And when the play was actually being performed, the demons were offended by their portrayal. Asuras were offended by their portrayal. And they actually felt so offended. They were insulted because, the play they thought insulted them. They were so offended because of being improperly criticized that they went to attack the actors. And it was then when Indra and Brahma came to the actors' defense. After that, gods were positioned on all four corners of the stage, and Indra declared that the stage would be a place where everything could be said and nothing could be prohibited. So this was one of the most ancient Indian texts, that of Natya Shastra, and we can find an explicit and extreme defense of freedom of expression on the stage. This was the only incidents where we find any kind of defense of freedom of speech that I came across, but I'm sure there are many others as well. But till now, I have just gathered a few other philosophical defenses of free speech, mostly Western. I'll probably do one more episode defending in the defense of free speech, but that one will not be philosophical. That one will discuss more about the legalities in the discourse in India and what limitations we have on free speech. Where do those limitations actually come from? There's a history to it. And what is the best standard of free speech today? So this was a philosophical episode, but whenever I take up the topic of free speech again, I will discuss more about how it is actually implemented in the world today. So we know that the best example of free speech is the example of USA. They have the best standard of free speech, and we'll also discuss how the free speech situation is in India. What happened when the constitution was being drafted? What happened in the First Amendment of India, where free speech was limited, and contrast that with the First Amendment in USA, where free speech was expanded upon. And I'll discuss all of this in a future episode, and I'll let you know about that episode on Twitter and all other platforms. Till then, namaste, and do subscribe and like the video if you want, and please use the comment section to let me know what you think about this episode. Thank you.